Good morning, Houdat Nation, and especially to our Bayou Blitz friends and family. Welcome into the Saints News Network Bayou Blitz pregame show for Week 6. The Cincinnati Bengals traveling to New Orleans to take on the New Orleans Saints. Lots of former LSU Tigers going to be making their Louisiana homecoming. But that's not the big news so far this morning, Bob, is it? With a lot of injuries and elevations we have to get to. But without further ado, I'm Brendan Boylan. That's my buddy and partner in crime, Bob Rose. Bob, how's it going this morning? And have you mentally got all the notes and everything from the last couple days with this New Orleans Saints? I feel like we're talking about a new roster every day.
It sure feels like it. Good morning, Brendan. Good morning, Bayou Blitz family. And folks, I am pretty sure I got injured during Brendan's introduction, so I too will be a game time decision. Listen, the Saints are a walking mass unit. This has the real vibe of all of last season. And really, what's happened to the Saints so far this year? They haven't even been nearly close to a healthy team since week one. This rash of injuries is ridiculous. Without further ado, let's get to that because that's going to take up most of our time.
That might take up all 30 minutes of our pregame.
It might. Officially out: Jameis Winston, Michael Thomas, Jarvis Landry, Deontay Hardy, who was put on injured reserve yesterday. Defensively, officially out: Marshawn Lattimore, Peyton Turner. Officially listed as a game time decision or questionable is Chris Olave. We are waiting for official word to drop, but it does not look like Olave is going to play today. I myself came to that presumption yesterday when the New Orleans Saints elevated 3 wide receivers from their practice squad to the active roster. Those 3 are Keith Kirkwood, who was active last week. We saw Keith, get into some significant action towards the end of the game. Kevin White, who was signed to the practice squad last week, re-signed to the practice squad, and rookie returner Rashid Shaheed. Now, we don't foresee Rashid getting a whole lot of offensive snaps, but you never know with this team. The obvious elevation of Shaheed was to take over return duties, which is going to be key with Deontay Hardy out a minimum of the next 4 weeks because of his designation to injured reserve. If they don't go with Rashid Shaheed as the returner, last week what they did, they used Taysom Hill to return kickoffs, and they use Marquez Callaway to return punts. And we also know that Dwayne Washington is capable of returning kickoffs too. Defensively, Peyton Turner, not a huge loss. He has been quite a disappointing number 1 draft pick so far. More on that another time. Marshawn Lattimore, though, that's a big loss. Because I don't have to tell you folks, if you've done any reading of our articles whatsoever this week, the Cincinnati is coming in with 3 very talented receivers and Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and Tyler Boyd. Now, T. Higgins is dealing with an ankle injury of his own, and he may not be active for today. But a lot of people expected Marshawn Lattimore to be isolated on Jamar Chase more often than not. So that takes a big a big part of the Saints defensive equation out. The Saints did elevate Chris Harris from the practice squad to the active roster, and I would expect Chris to get some significant playing time. And we don't know about Marcus May. He is listed as questionable. Everything that we're hearing says that May is going to play this week, but we thought that last week as Brendan and I came on, and actually news broke while we were on the air that Marcus May was inactive. So we'll keep our fingers crossed there. Folks, I think that is all the I misspoke. I said Jameis Winston was declared out. Winston will actually dress today as the emergency quarterback behind Andy Dalton. And I presume that if something were to happen to Dalton, Taysom Hill will get the next look at quarterback if Winston is listed as an emergency. So, that's an interesting development in Jameis Winston's recovery from the back and ankle injury. But we shouldn't – if something – happens that Jameis Winston plays today, then that means that something else went horribly, horribly wrong for the Saints.
Whew, well, that took a little bit, but like you said, I think we're all caught up. Yes, Jameis is active today. New Orleans Saints released their emergency quarterback from the last couple weeks, which was an indication that Jameis was going to go. Receiver wise, Bob, this is not as talented of a unit as we talked about all year. This is like you said at the beginning. This goes almost identical to last season with more injuries. You're going to be without 4 receivers today if you include Deontay Hardy, and you and I are making the assumption that Olave's not going to go today. Even Adam Schefter came out this morning and said he's not expected to play. So that gives you Callaway, Traquan Smith, the elevation of Kirkwood, and the elevation of Kevin White. Obviously, Rashid, if needed, could play receiver, but he's primarily going to be a returner. How does that bode for Andy Dalton? Because I wrote in a fantasy piece yesterday that if the Saints are going to win this football game, it's going to have to look a lot like it did last week when the Saints had Alvin Kamara and Taysom Hill rush for 100 yards. And if any of you were on our podcast Wednesday while I was very sleep deprived, I went on a rant about how not to play Taysom Hill this week. Well, if you read my article yesterday, things had changed in about 48 hours because at this point, if you're looking for a Saint to start that's not Alvin Kamara, I think Taysom's the next best option because he's going to get more than those 5.5 average scrimmage touches per game out of absolute necessity. Bob, do you see it the same way?
Yeah, I absolutely see it the same way. Only I'll add one thing into this, and I sort of hinted at that at what I'm about to say when I did my Saints passing attack preview for this week's matchup. Taysom Hill threw one pass last week, and it resulted in a 22-yard touchdown pass to Adam Troutman. Taysom Hill has also started 9 games at quarterback for the New Orleans Saints, and although those 9 games resembled an old high school single wing T formation more often than not, we know that Taysom Hill is capable of throwing the football. I think I could see Pete Carmichael having to design an offensive game plan. This is not a Saints team that's going to be able to run the ball 60 times, throw it 5 times, and expect to win. That's just not the NFL now. I don't care what your personnel is. Yeah, they're going to have to lean heavily on the running game with Alvin Kamara, Taysom Hill, and probably Mark Ingram too. But you're going to have to throw the ball, somewhat successfully to keep the Bengals from literally stacking 9 or 10 guys in the box. So I can actually see Taysom Hill when he lines up behind center, where 95 to 98% of the time he is going to run the ball this week. And they threw something out on tape for the Bengals to digest last week with that pass to Troutman. This week, Taysom might be able to fool the Bengals with a couple of those quick throws over the middle. It would keep that Cincinnati defense honest. Again, it's not the type of play or this type of scheme that you completely base your game plan around, but they are added wrinkles that could keep the Bengals defense off balance. And when you are as depleted as the New Orleans Saints are at wide receiver right now, with really, and I'll just come out and say it, there's only one bona fide receiver, NFL receiver on this roster today, and that is Marquez Callaway. There's no disrespect to Kevin White. There's no disrespect to Keith Kirkwood, who I happen to like. That is a disrespect to Traquan Smith, and I mean every bit of that. But Marquez Callaway, in my opinion, is the only bona fide NFL receiver that could probably earn a job on just about any other team, in the league. Not as a number 1 or number 2, mind you, but still a job. So again, the offensive game plan is going to center around Alvin Kamara, center around Taysom Hill, and hopefully center around the ability to control the line of scrimmage. But to do that, you need to keep the Bengals off balance too. Maybe a couple of Taysom Hill passes, when he's lined up behind center. Certainly using Hill as a wide receiver, obviously Kamara as a wide receiver, not just out of the backfield, but lined out wide and in the slot as well. It's going to be. If I'm Pete Carmichael, I'm designing some seriously crazy stuff to keep the Bengals off balance this week.
You almost have to. And quick note with Taysom Hill being a receiver, only 1 reception on the year. for Taysom Hill, who's listed at a tight end. That came back in week 1 against Atlanta. Well, we have an official inactive list. So let's get to that. The official inactive list. A lot of these guys Bob already mentioned, but officially official: Jarvis Landry, Chris Olave, Michael Thomas, Marshawn Lattimore, Calvin Throckmorton, Nick Vannett, and Peyton Turner are all out today for New Orleans. I know that earlier in the show, Bob listed off so many names. There's a lot to keep up with, so I'm going to get to some of these questions. Is Rashid active? Yes, he is active. He will be the number 1 return man today. So Kevin White not dressing out today? No, Kevin White will dress out today. He is active along with Keith Kirkwood. Those guys were elevated. Olave officially inactive? Yes. And how about this question? Could Juwan Johnson be used today more as a receiver? Absolutely. I think what Bob said with Taysom Hill attacking the middle of the field and trying to keep the defense honest, that's where you have guys like Juwan Johnson and your Troutmans, those big-bodied type of receivers. As much as people might not want to hear it, Kevin White as well, being a bigger receiver, could definitely be a mismatch down the seams in this one against Cincinnati. But let's not sleep on Cincinnati's defense, Bob.
No,
this is a Cincinnati team that's 2-3, but this is a defense that has yet to allow more than 20 points in a single game. What do you like about the Bengals defense?
There's a lot, and I'd like to digress for a second. Yeah, I do believe that the tight ends could be a valuable asset in today's ball game, especially Juwan Johnson, who is the most accomplished receiver out of the group. But we have seen Adam Troutman make some plays as a pass receiver, and again, Pete Carmichael, Andy Dalton, even Taysom Hill when he lines up back there, they're going to have to do whatever they can to keep that Cincinnati defense guessing, because the Bengals have a very formidable front seven. They put a lot of pressure on the quarterback, led by former New Orleans Saint Trey Hendrickson, but Hendrickson has an outstanding complement at the other edge in Sam Hubbard, an extremely underrated edge rusher. They have a defensive tackle who I wanted the Saints to get this offseason so badly, and BJ Hill. And BJ is not only a space eater, he is a bona fide, a legitimate threat as an interior pass rusher too, because the Bengals have those threats up front, along with some depth at the edge. Where they won't get worn down late in games. Cincinnati blitzes very little. If they do, and that's always a strategy that I would suggest if I'm designing a game plan against the New Orleans Saints offense. If they do, they're going to bring linebackers Logan Wilson or Jermaine Pratt up the interior and test those human turnstiles known as Andrus Peat and Cesar Ruiz. Pete and Ruiz have been much improved as run blockers in the last 2 or 3 weeks, but still major liabilities in pass protection. So if the Bengals blitz, that's where they're going to do it. However, they like to use Wilson and Pratt and Akeem Davis-Gaither in pass coverage. And all 3 of those guys, they're big physical guys, but they're underrated athletes, and they have extremely natural awareness in zone coverage. They will make play. In fact, Wilson led the Bengals in interceptions last year, had 3 or 4 picks. So he's a playmaker on that second level. Cincinnati's defense, or secondary, mind you, they have what could be the best 1-2 safety tandem in the National Football League. Another former Saint, Von Bell, teams up with Jesse Bates. Everybody throughout the league talks about Jesse Bates, but Von Bell, we know from his days in New Orleans, he's a hell of a player too. They have a few very physical cornerbacks. They're not guys that are going to jump off the page as far as elite man coverage ability, but Chidobe Awuzie, Mike Hilton is very good from the slot. And remember that Cincinnati used a first-round pick on Dax Hill, who's listed as a safety, but he's listed as a safety the way Chauncey Gardner-Johnson was listed as a safety. Dax Hill is going to be their slot guy more often than not. The weakest, and I saved this man for last, the weakest link on that defense by far is Eli Apple. But even Eli's having a pretty solid season by Eli Apple standards. But when the Saints do pass, and if the Bengals go into traditional man coverage, which they don't often do, if whoever is isolated onto Eli Apple, that's who should and more often than not will get the ball. As I described him in two different articles, I described him as a notorious head case, who almost always will crumble in the face of even a little adversity. So if the Bengals have a weak spot, it's there, because that front seven that I mentioned before, I only touched on their ability to rush the passer. They are darn good at stopping the run too. They rank sixth in the National Football League, and they've only allowed one team with over 100 yards on the ground against them. So if the Saints' game plan is based around the ground game, and we believe that it will be, it's going to be some tough sledding and a big challenge for that offensive line.
Absolutely. Speaking of the offensive line, question: who's at left tackle? It's going to be James Hurst. I think the offensive line's pretty healthy outside of Throckmorton, who was inactive today, and Throckmorton not a starter. So the Saints might be as healthy as they've been all year at the offensive line in the last couple of weeks. That's always a good thing to see. Another thing about this defense for the Bengals, Bob, is they have not allowed a second half touchdown all year, which is unheard of for a team that's 2-3, especially with such a high-powered offense. And I know the offensive line hasn't been good, and that was their big knock last year, and they still went to the Super Bowl. And I'm sure a lot of you LSU fans out there know how close the Bengals were to winning the Super Bowl, and how it really did come down to that offensive line. That final fourth down play, Jamar Chase broke free, and if Burrow could deliver the football, that's a touchdown. You're going up in the Super Bowl with less than a minute left in the game. And I was a little surprised that they didn't address the offensive line a little bit more than they did in the offseason. I think they tried, and it just hasn't worked. But hey, remember when Jamar Chase was taken to the first round, there was all that chatter that they should have went left tackle out of Oregon. And they didn't. And I actually think they made the right choice, because Chase has been a monster, but you'd like to see a little bit more protection for Burrow if you're a Bengals fan. We'll see if the Saints can take advantage of that. Remember, when Davenport's healthy outside of this season, he hasn't played super well, but when Davenport's been healthy, he has been a problem. And Cameron Jordan is now just 5 sacks away from tying Ricky Jackson for the most in franchise history. Jordan's one of 4 defensive linemen ever to record 7 or more sacks in, I think it's 8 years in a row. And he's looking to continue that. So we'll see what kind of pressure they can get up on Joe Burrow. We talked about the Saints offense. It's probably going to revolve around the rushing attack. We saw less Mark Ingram than any game this season last week. A lot of that because of the heavy dosage of Taysom Hill. How important is Ingram in today's game?
When you're missing as many wide receivers as the Saints are, it's all hands on deck for everybody remaining. So I think Ingram is very important. Not so much in volume of touches, more or less what he does with those touches. The more effective Mark Ingram can be, the more effective that will make Alvin Kamara on the perimeter. Because if you can have an effective ground game with, we know what Taysom Hill can do, and we know that most of his runs are going to at least start inside before he bounces it back outside, over the guard, or those off tackle RPO plays. Ingram, at this stage of his career, Ingram is strictly an inside runner. So if Ingram can be effective on those inside runs, then that will allow you to use Alvin Kamara on the perimeter more, because you won't need to rely on him to pick up those yardage inside the tackles. Because you already have your threat and your productivity with Ingram there. And again, that's just one more thing that could test the Cincinnati defense from sideline to sideline, because you have to, even if Mark Ingram is having a good game as a runner, you still have to address Alvin Kamara first and foremost. And when Kamara comes out of the backfield, either by motion or comes out of the huddle lined up out wide, you have to address that and spread your defense out. That will give Taysom Hill, Mark Ingram, or even maybe Dwayne Washington more room to operate between the tackles.
Remember, Ingram also arguably, I don't even know if there's an argument about it, the best pass blocker out of the running backs for the New Orleans Saints. So he might end up being very important in that case as well. Flipping the script, we talked about how talented the Cincinnati Bengals are offensively at their skill positions. New Orleans, we mentioned without Marshawn Lattimore, it's a big blow. What do you want to see out of Paulson Adebo and Bradley Roby today?
Adebo, physicality wise, Adebo is the best cornerback you got on the roster without Lattimore. But he's been slumping since his return. He's allowed, I couldn't believe this. It popped off of the page. Adebo is allowing 82% completion rate when he's targeted since he's come back from that ankle injury. But that's one of the problems. I still don't, Paulson Adebo doesn't look like he's 100% healthy to me. You need a healthy Adebo, or hopefully a healthy Adebo, because and I mentioned it on our Wednesday night broadcast of the Bayou Blitz. What I would have done, how I would have designed a game plan against Cincinnati if I had the New Orleans Saints defensive personnel, would be get physical, especially with Higgins, and we still don't know whether he's playing or not, but especially with Higgins and Chase, because those guys are taller, very athletic, and they're not going to be intimidated. But since they are lean athletes, it's easier to kind of throw off the timing of their route. And Cincinnati does run a lot of timing routes. And if you could, the more you could throw off that timing, the more that forces Joe Burrow to hold on to the ball, and kind of reset his progressions, which means that gives your pass rush an extra second or two, to get to the Cincinnati backfield or to the Cincinnati quarterback. So, I realize Paulson Adebo is struggling, but still, with his, with his physical style of play, I still allow him to play bump man at the line of scrimmage. You have to get your hands on that receiver, though. Do that. Play Tyrann Mathieu and hopefully Marcus May as a two high safety deep. Bradley Roby is not as adept at bump and run coverage, at man-on-man coverage from the line, from the snap, as what Lattimore or Adebo are. But I would line Bradley Roby on whatever side he's going to be lined up on. I would line Bradley Roby up about 5 yards off of the line. Again, so that way, because Roby does have great anticipation and breaking skills on the ball in front of him. So, you line him up in that short off-ball man coverage. That allows him, it still puts him in a position to make plays. Now, the Bengals defense or receivers are fast enough to run by almost anybody. So that's why I line up Mathieu and hopefully May. At too high. We've oftentimes seen one of those safeties up close to the line of scrimmage. I wouldn't do that today. I would take a gamble that my linebackers and defensive line can A, pressure Burrow, B, stop mixing in the running game, so that way I keep extra deep support back against those Bengals receivers.
And finally, looking at the New Orleans Saints offense before we get into predictions and what have you, we've talked a lot about the receivers. We talked about how this is going to be primarily focused on the run. But if there's one receiver that you expect could come up big today, who is it and why?
From the wide receiver position or as a pass catcher?
We'll say as a pass catcher. We'll give you a couple more options because you're pretty limited when it's receiver.
Because if you're going to force me to pick, among wide receivers, I could see somebody like, Kevin White making a play deep or so. But I stick by what I said before, is that Marquez Callaway is the only bona fide NFL wide receiver on this roster today. As a pass catcher, look for Juwan Johnson. We kind of hinted and teased about Adam Troutman earlier. Juwan Johnson is the player at tight end that can make plays down the field. And Cincinnati's secondary, as solid as they play, they've allowed 3 tight ends with at least 70 yards receiving against them so far this year. Now Juwan Johnson is never going to be mistaken, as an all-pro caliber or an elite tight end, but he's athletic. He's a converted receiver, so he's athletic enough to make plays down the field. He is that big-bodied wideout that the Saints under Sean Payton had always coveted, like you said before, Brendan. So, outside of the obvious choice of Alvin Kamara, if I'm going to pick a pass catcher to have a sneaky good day, I'm going to go with Juwan Johnson.
Get to a question. Saints interior defensive line healthy today? Yeah. As healthy as they can be. This is still a position, and this is a discussion for a different time. Maybe not this Wednesday because I will be out, but maybe the Wednesday after. That's still a position I feel like the Saints really need to address. and there's some guys out there still that I think could really help the Saints. However, it is a little harder to go to a player like Ndamukong Suh in particular and try to get him to sign on to a team that right now is not remotely close to being a lock for the playoffs. But there are some familiar faces that we've mentioned before that could certainly help this team. Some other guys giving predictions about pass catchers. Scoob says Keith Kirkwood. I love Keith Kirkwood. Like I said,
So
we
do
share
I.
the same hometown. Gotta love the kid. Kevin White was Brannon's, and Alvin Kamara by Robert Clark. Yeah, he's going to be a big part of the pass game as well. I can't say I'm going to predict for him to have 200 scrimmage yards again or close to it, because that's a tough ask, especially when you have a defense honing in on you. But he's going to have to be a big part of it if the Saints want to come out victorious today. Robert also says no turnovers, ball security. Well, this is a team that leads the league in turnovers, so it'd be nice to see something of a change. It would also be nice to see the defense come away with some takeaways, because Burrow hasn't protected the ball very well himself this season. There might be some opportunities for the Saints to jump on that. Bob, how do you see this game going? Before we came on, we said you see the game going one of two ways. If you had to pick, which way do you think it's going to go?
Oh, God. If the New Orleans Saints have any hope of winning this game, it's going to be a lower scoring defensive slugfest. I don't mean like a 10-7 game or anything like that, but a game in the low 20s at the very, very most. I don't see the Saints having the offensive personnel to get in any kind of shootout. But the key to this game is the New Orleans Saints defensive line, particularly the edge rushing position. And especially Cam Jordan and Marcus Davenport. Cam and Marcus have the ability to affect a game every single week. They really are keys to this one, because the Bengals, Burrow's been sacked 19 times, hit 37 times this year. 14 of those sacks and 24 of those hits have come from the edge rusher position. Cam and Marcus have to come up big, and the New Orleans Saints have to. There's no question about it this week. They have to stop the run, and force the Bengals, into some one-dimensional football. Now, I acknowledge that one dimension is extremely dangerous, especially without Marshawn Lattimore. But again, you have a Bengals offensive line that has struggled. It is not playing very well again this year. So if you stop the Bengals running game, that allows your pass rushers to kind of pin their ears back. That's where the difference in this ball game could lie. Offensively, other than the obvious, no turnovers, and crisp execution. It's going to come down to coaching. I said at the beginning that I'm hoping that if Pete Carmichael is an offensive genius, we're going to see it this week. But it wouldn't surprise me to see the Saints, really come out with some kind of crazy game plan, especially early on, just to get the Bengals thinking, okay, we don't know what they're going to do next. We don't know what angle they're going to hit us from. You have to manufacture points that way. Almost do it with smoke and mirrors. Defensive football, field position, the kicking game has got to come up big. Both Gillikin, and Will Lutz, obviously, but also the kick coverage. I do see the Saints keeping this game fairly low scoring and pretty competitive. But if I'm forced to pick a final score, I'm going to go with one differently than I did earlier in the week. I'm going to go Bengals 24, Saints 13.
Close enough, but sounds like the defense is going to keep it close enough, but the offense isn't going to be able to manufacture enough to make it happen. I like to be a little bit of an optimist. I
tried. I tried.
This is tough. And, you and I had talked about it on Wednesday, is that if the Saints had two of those three receivers that are now out, it would be a different story. But
yep.
You are legitimately talking about, you could make the case, probably more last year than this year, but your receiving corps that you're missing today, you got your top three, and then Hardy is your 4, your 5. I think you're going to give the 4 to Callaway more times than not. But you're missing 4 of your top 5 receivers today. That's hard for any team at any level, not just the NFL. that's going to make it extremely difficult. You're also without your starting quarterback. I know Andy has played well enough
Yes.
to keep the Saints within striking distance, even in the loss to Minnesota in London, and obviously the victory. But like Bob said, and like I said in articles this week as well, the Saints can't get no shootout with Joe Burrow. And I think that they're going to keep it close. But I'm with Bob. I think that the offense does enough to keep the ball out of the Cincinnati Bengals' hands and running the football effectively enough to sustain drives, whether they result in points or not. But I see the Saints struggling to score points again. And there's now more tape on Taysom Hill this year than there was before. And I don't think there's any surprise to people that when Taysom's in the game, he's going to be running the ball 9 times out of 10, probably 9.5 times out of 10. But I think the Bengals are going to come expecting that. I think the Bengals are going to come expecting a high dosage of Alvin Kamara. And there's a lot of talent and veteran leadership on that defense. And I think that for the Bengals, that's going to show, and they're going to remind people why they were the AFC champions a year ago. So I'm going to take the Bengals 21-17 over New Orleans. Kind of similar to Bob. I think it's going to be one of those situations where the defense keeps the Saints in the game, but the offense just isn't quite able to punch it home. Well, Bob, that's our predictions for the week. Do have some announcements. I kind of teased at it a little bit earlier. I will not be on the Bayou Blitz on Wednesday. Bob's hoping to have someone fill in to give you guys another great show on Wednesday, but my world tour continues, as Bob says. I will be out in Las Vegas taking care of some business stuff and won't be able to make the time work because, I'll be 3 hours behind, and you know as well as I do, Bob, that gets confusing as heck. I did the Bayou Blitz an hour behind, and I almost missed the show. I don't think I've ever admitted that to you, but I almost missed the show because I was like, oh, I got another hour. Oh my god, it's 9:00 that time. I gotta go. So Bob will have a show for you guys next week, and that's going to go along with the pregame and halftime for next week as well. More than likely going to be a familiar face sitting in my seat. But we will have halftime today, so you guys get me for one more short segment. But Bob, where can the people follow you online if they don't already? Because everybody should, right?
Yeah, everybody should. That's a law, folks. Follow Brendan and I. You're right. First of all, thank you for tuning in with us this morning. For the Saints News Network Bayou Blitz pregame show. Make sure you join Brendan and I at halftime. Hopefully, we'll be able to have a little bit of a smile on our face. And like Brendan said, unless other forces step in, and it is Halloween season, unless other forces step in, I will be doing the Bayou Blitz this Wednesday, without my, distinguished colleague. But there is going to be a familiar face sitting right here beside of me, so make sure you tune in for that. In the meantime, remember, folks, we have a short week of Saints football this week, or a quick turnaround, rather. The Saints play again on Thursday night at the Arizona Cardinals. So all of our work this week is going to be condensed, coming out really quickly, so make sure you stay tuned to us and what we're doing. And to help you do that, you can follow me on Facebook, Bob Rose. I'm over on Twitter at BobbyR2613. Obviously, as mentioned before, you can follow all of our works through the Saints News Network, at Saints News on Twitter, or through the Bayou Blitz group on Facebook.
And for myself, you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at BT Boylan. Like Bob said, you can follow all of our work with the Saints News Network. It's going to be tight. It's going to be condensed next week. Gotta love Thursday nights because it makes everything that you have for, 7 days essentially worth of work. It's condensed to 4. Means some sleepless nights, a lot more research, a lot more numbers running through your head. But Bob's young, so he can handle it, right? But again, you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram at BT Boylan. Just wanted to give a quick shout out to some of the guys that may be watching that worked on the Dancing Bulldogs with me. Happy 2-year anniversary of the film. For you guys that have watched the film, we really appreciate it. I can't believe it's been 2 years since I worked on that film and it came out, and the success that we've had. So for everybody that's been able to watch that, we appreciate you guys. And Bob and I will be back for halftime. It's going to be a real interesting one inside of the Superdome. The one thing I request is if any of you guys have like a half Bengals, half Saints jersey, or you're doing like we're rooting for the LSU guys, that's weird. Just don't do it. It's weird. I've never liked that. Pick your team for Saturday, pick your team for Sunday, and distinguish between the two. Bob, any comments on that or thoughts on that?
You kept it much more PG than I could have. Folks, literally the only reason you should be wearing a jersey like that is if you are related to the person that you are, a person whose jersey you are wearing. Otherwise, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to see it. You're obviously free to make your own decisions, but leave me out of it.
Well, there you have it from the strong voice of the seasoned veteran Bob Rose. For the Bayou Blitz pregame show, that's Bob. I'm Brendan. We will see you guys at halftime. Until then, enjoy the game, grab some snacks, and we'll see you in a couple hours.